mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa. Humie, tai kie. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai, ki te tenei hui. Nau mai haere mai ki te whare Apārangi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Paul Atkins tōku ingoa. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Society Te Apārangi, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you this evening. Thank you so much for being here. Firstly, you may notice that Rebecca McPhee is absent tonight. Regrettably, she is unwell and has been unable to join us. It is a great pity as she is so invested in tonight's themes through her role as the 2024 JD Stout Fellow at the Stout Research Centre for New Zealand Studies at Victoria University. Her research there is focused on the capacity of grassroots and community organisations to disrupt the harms of poverty. You can, however, hear her speak at the Pakakore Poverty by Design conference that the Stout Research Centre is organising in Wellington next month. Please go online and have a look. Royal Society Te Apārangi operates under an Act to advance and promote science, technology and the humanities in New Zealand. In the functions set out by the Act, we provide expert advice on important public issues to the government and the community. Our council initiated this work to prompt greater awareness and discussion of the issues around fairness, equality and equity in our society. We pulled together a diverse panel of experts for this, some of whom are here tonight, and some you would have seen on the slideshow that has just played. We are very grateful to the members of Te Tapeke panel who produced a body of insightful work in the form of deep dive spotlights and expert perspectives, and they're on the table outside. If you haven't seen them, please do have a look at the end of this evening and pick up some of those. At the time that infamous event called COVID-19 prevented us from doing all the publicity that we'd hoped to do for the launch of these really amazing resources. We do encourage you to explore them. The information and outlooks they contain are as pertinent today as they were then, and it feels very timely to be here tonight to reprise that conversation. Before I introduce our esteemed panel, I would like to acknowledge the diligence and support of the Society's staff and to thank the many experts who assisted us during the course of this work. Te Tapeke Fair Futures co-convener, Dame Lowell Goddard, is also unable to be with us tonight, but I would like to acknowledge her co-leadership of the panel alongside that of Andrew. Doing this work, Dame Lowell commented, "The social justice issues New Zealand faces are clearly not static, and their dynamism is not amenable to any quick fix or permanent solution. It is necessary to constantly calibrate and recalibrate to keep abreast of the critical issues that cause imbalance. That necessity to constantly calibrate and recalibrate is exactly why we're here tonight." Now, I have it unanimously agreed that none of our panel wish their full biographical notes to be read out. Particularly because it would take all evening, because they are extremely distinguished. But you will know all of them, I trust, and you can see their faces and their titles behind you on the screen. I will just comment. Andrew Erueti is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Auckland. Alan Bollard will be known to many of you for his work between 2002 and 12 as the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Jonathan Boston is Emeritus Professor of Public Policy in the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. And Philippa Howden-Chapman is a distinguished professor of public health at the University of Otago, Wellington. That little reminder of who these people are seriously undercooks how distinguished they are. Please, if you don't know them, do go and check them out. But I would like to just say that it is a huge privilege to have you all here this evening. Thank you so much for agreeing to spend your Tuesday evening with us. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here, and I'm now going to hand over to Andrew. Kia ora. Thank you.
O tēnā koe pō. Ko te mihi tuatai ki te kai karakia I tūwharatia tēnei wānanga I tēnei pō. Ka rere ngā manu, ngā mihi mahana ki ngā tūpuna, ki ngā mate kua wihi atu ki te pō. Moi mai rā, moi mai rā. Whakahoki ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, ngā kānohi ora kua tai mai ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa, tēnei te mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. Me tō tātou hoa mahi kua tai mai, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. Okay, kia ora koutou, no mai and welcome to this panel discussion. And we're very much looking forward to this. In Rebecca's absence, I'm going to pick up Rākau and facilitate this discussion with my esteemed colleagues here. We had a remarkable opportunity to gather. We first met a couple of years ago now, before COVID. A number of people from a range of different disciplines to talk about this idea of fairness. We spent a lot of time actually talking about what fairness and equity and equality actually means. So I think we might kick off with that before we delve into the different kaupapa. I'm going to start here with Professor Boston, just to talk about that question of meaning and definition. So, Professor Boston, the Climate Commission observed recently that the impacts from climate change will not be distributed evenly. At the same time, decisions about adaptation and dealing with loss are often being made in an ad hoc and reactive way. And that seems to be a big red flag if we are concerned about fairness and equity. But what, to your mind, is fairness, equity, and equality?
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I think it's a testimony to the fact that justice or fairness matters, that there are so many people gathered at this time of the day to hear us reflect on this matter. So the question of what is fair or just or equitable has been debated over millennia, and there have been many different theories of justice or fairness advanced and many different principles, and some of those principles are in tension. Some people think that, to quote Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and others are not quite so confident about that. Now, in terms of the principles of justice, there are some that are more agreed upon than others, and one of the principles that is, I think, fairly widely accepted is the so-called Aristotelian principle of comparative justice, or the principle of like treatment. And that principle is basically that like cases should be treated alike, or to put it more precisely, cases which are alike in all relevant respects should be treated alike. It's kind of a principle of consistency. And Aristotle went on to say, and where there are differences, the cases should be treated differently in proportion to the differences. So there's also the principle of proportion. That, of course, is a formal principle, and it begs a very critical question, which is, what are relevant differences? Is age a relevant difference? Is gender a relevant difference? Is race a relevant difference? Is somebody's needs a relevant difference? So in order to apply that principle of comparative justice, we need to have what are called, if you like, material principles of justice that give some substance to answering this question as to what is a relevant difference. In cutting a very long story short, Andrew, there are, broadly speaking, egalitarian material principles and non-egalitarian principles. Many of you will be absolutely familiar with this, and I'm sorry if this sounds very, very basic, but the key egalitarian principles of justice are treating people equally, or the principle of equality, and the principle of need, the principle of meeting people's needs, particularly basic needs, but also perhaps a broader conception of needs. Then there are the non-egalitarian principles of justice, of which there are various ones. The most widely recognized would be the idea that you should reward people on the basis of their merit, somehow assessed, or that you should reward people on the basis of their contribution, somehow assessed, or that you should reward people on the basis of their effort. Many of my students, I think, would love to be rewarded on the basis of their effort, but it's very difficult to assess what their effort might have been, and whether it was mostly just copying off ChatGPT or something else. Now, as you can appreciate, egalitarian and non-egalitarian principles of justice lead you in different directions, and then for one of the critical questions becomes, well, how might you prioritize these principles and apply them in particular contexts? Treating everyone on the basis that they have equal worth, value, or dignity, irrespective of race or gender or age and so on, in my view, is absolutely critical. And that principle is now recognized in many international treaties and other international instruments. And being a lawyer, you'd know all about that, Andrew. The principle of ensuring that people can have their basic needs met is also, I think, widely accepted. Not necessarily widely practiced, but certainly widely accepted. It does beg the question, of course, what constitutes basic needs. Now, to the extent that I agree that we should treat everyone equally and that we should meet people's basic needs, in that sense I'm an egalitarian. That doesn't mean that I don't think the non-egalitarian principles are relevant, but it seems to me that fundamentally, if we don't treat people as having equal worth and we don't seek to meet their basic needs, then we are not meeting the very, very fundamental requirements of justice or fairness. Coming quickly then to climate change, Andrew, there are at least three interconnected issues of fairness or justice in the climate change context. The first is, how do we share the costs or burdens of mitigating climate change, that is, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonising the economy and so on, and there are genuine costs to be met in that regard. The second is, how do we share the costs or burdens of adaptation fairly? And there's no question there are very significant costs of adaptation, and those costs are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger as the century goes on, as we experience more and more severe impacts from climate change, and as we experience particularly increasing sea levels, which will do huge damage to coastal infrastructure, Alan's area, and human settlements all over the world. And then the third question really is, how do we ensure intergenerational justice in the context of an issue that has extraordinary sort of intergenerational consequences, whereas the decisions that you made to drive your car here and not be able to find a park will, sorry to say, contribute to the impacts on generations to come. So, how might we answer those questions? We can come back to one or two of them in your subsequent questions, I think, Andrew, but very quickly, it would seem to me that those who have contributed disproportionately to the problem of climate change should be expected to bear a disproportionate part of the costs. So I'm afraid as a country, New Zealand has been a disproportionate contributor, certainly on a per capita basis, to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and thus to climate change, and as a contributor historically, cumulatively, to a disproportionate amount of the problem. We should be, as a country, in broad terms, expected to bear a disproportionate part of the costs. That's essentially a polluter pays kind of principle. The second point I'd quickly make is that those who have the greatest ability to pay should also be expected to bear a disproportionate portion of the the burden. And also that in all that we do, we should be seeking to protect the least advantaged citizens globally as well as locally, and ensure that all citizens, both now and in the future, are able to meet their basic needs. That's just a beginning. I mean, there's an awful lot more one could say, but that's kind of just laying out some very quick formal and material principles and in thinking about the context of climate change.
Tēnā koe, Jonathan. So we had, there's a lot in there, and I think that cross-cutting issue about definitions and what is fairness is likely to arise again. We talked a lot about this, as I said, also Indigenous conceptions of what justice and fairness might mean, and so the paper I wrote kind of tried to climb into, consider that through the lens of tikanga Māori, and but there's also questions that are quite contentious about whether perhaps there's a commonality that can transcend cultures in terms of, I think about the idea of mana tangata and mana tupuna, for example, and autonomy and individualism and agency and liberalism. Are they poles apart, for example, and how different is mana motuhake to self-determination? So anyway, but before we come back to that, because I know that Alan has some comments to make about those kind of broad concepts too, about definitions, but I want to turn now to Philippa, to our distinguished professor here, to talk about your work on housing, well recognised. And the question is, you and your research group have proved that bad housing makes us sick and that good housing is essential to good health. Your work has directly influenced public policy, i.e. the healthy home standards. Where are we now in terms of healthy homes? Have things materially improved 5 years on from those rules? Just a little question.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi ki tō kaupapa tēnā rā te Tapeke. And thank you for your introduction, Erueti. Well, I'm going to take, given the framework has been laid out, I'd like to look at the Aotearoa basis of inequality and quality. And we started with, I think, one of the good things about colonisation as we sat down and thought what would be fair and te tiriti. Of course, the bad things are that it wasn't followed up as it should have been. But nevertheless, I think the importance of our society as a whole, especially with the contribution of the Māori and Pākehā in fighting the Second World War, and what came out of that was the recognition of the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And one of the key aspects of that is that housing is a human right. And that's one of the things that our group, He Kāngoranga, Housing and Health Research Program, really thinks is critically important. And at the moment, we're extremely concerned that while people are no longer being admitted in any numbers to emergency housing, and a lot of them have left it, the government has no idea where they are and doesn't consider it important that a great number of those people are children. So the question is, where are those people? Are they in crowded houses? Are they in camping grounds? Are they in cars? And for me, fairness and equity is that we elect a government that uses our taxation and uses the organisations that it has at its disposal to direct, to make sure that everybody lives in good housing. Now, your question about what we have done, we looked and said, there is evidence we have to produce here, and so we've done a number of randomised trials about what the difference between different depths of insulation, different kinds of heating, different ways of ensuring that people don't fall in their houses. And we have shown quite dramatically, I think, that especially for younger people, babies, younger people and older people, the quality of your housing makes a huge, huge difference. And so that if we look about the co-benefits of housing, it's not just for the people in the house, which is where we spend most of our time, about 90% in New Zealand, as in most OECD countries, if you count the time that you sleep there. That's where it's really important to make sure it's warm and dry and there's no mould, that it's not too crowded, because that's when we know from the COVID exercise, the latest one, if you live in a crowded household, if the house wasn't designed for that, you are much more likely to succumb to COVID, just as in previously people succumbed to rheumatic fever and so forth. So we set about helping to develop the Healthy Home Standards, which are now in the Residential Tenancies Act. I'm a great believer that you need organisations that can propose legislation and also can monitor that regulation has been followed up. And in the case of the Healthy Home Standards, all landlords, whether they were public housing, community housing, or private landlords, all had to ensure that the house has good insulation in it, it's good ventilation, and it's good heating. And that we have seen, we've been monitoring, that community got behind that, and we have the Healthy Homes Initiative, where community groups work together with the Ministry of Health, and we've seen the decline in a lot of those infectious diseases. And we're just releasing the 5-year report showing quite dramatic drops in hospitalisation times in children, increasing times of them being at school and so forth. So I think that's what I consider fair, where you fund organisations that can provide evidence, independent evidence, that's public evidence involved to the public, that can go through into legislations, that there are organisations that can ensure that they go into the houses of private tenants, because private tenants are often quite scared to actually persist in saying to a landlord that the home is cold and damp and mouldy. And you'll hear me on radio in a few days talking about a terrible case that came to the Tenancy Tribunal, which led the 2 of the children being into hospital almost continuously. So yes, I think fair futures, both in terms of Te Tiriti, remembering that in the 1930s Māori had higher home ownership than Pākehā did, and so it's only the results of what happened in the war and the loss of land subsequently that Māori are now much more likely to be private rental in private rental homes than owning their own home, and that is not fair. And now you can't actually really own a home unless your grandparents passed on money to your parents who are able to give you bridging finance to get your own home. I don't think that's fair.
Tēnā koe. Thank you, Philippa. We're going to turn now to you, Ellen, to talk about, you're on the Infrastructure Commission, and we were talking earlier before we came on about the work that you're doing there with the reports on the concept of equity and equality. Do you want to share that with us about the work that you've been doing with the Commission?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. But if I can just start by saying, knowing this was coming up, I asked my students a couple of weeks ago their views on equity in New Zealand, and they pretty much all said it's bad and it's getting worse. They did not agree about what equity was, so thank you, Jonathan. I'll get you in to talk to them and clear that little one up.
Can I just say, Alan, that it's easier often to agree on things that are unjust than it is to agree on what constitutes justice. So it's actually easier to get people to say, actually, this is unjust, without them knowing really what, if you like, quote, perfect justice might be. Sorry, I should interrupt.
Sure. Very usefully, a couple of months ago, the Institute of Economic Research and Koitu from University of Auckland put out a report saying, what do New Zealanders think about fairness? And they found some similarities. They found that generally New Zealanders were saying there's something about general access, common access to opportunities was a very important part of fairness in the New Zealand sort of context. But there was a very bifurcated view, and that was pretty interesting, about who was saying that, who should have responsibility for ensuring fairness in New Zealand. 60% said the government primarily, 40% said primarily individuals, households, iwi, etc. When they were asked, what I asked my students, have things got worse from a fairness point of view compared to, in this case, 30 years ago, 50% of them said yes, they've got worse, 25% said no, they haven't. This group that was more optimistic tended to be older and more male, but interestingly, they couldn't find any particular differences with regard to ethnicity or income or education standards. One thing that did come out of this that I thought was quite amusing was they asked respondents what share of income and wealth in New Zealand the top 20% had. And Wellingtonians were wildly over the top in thinking that the top 20% held a lot more income and share than they actually do. And Aucklanders were way, way under, a huge difference. The Economist magazine a few years ago did a piece looking at fairness and equity across the OECD. And they said, maybe predictably, well, it all depends. Are we talking about income or are we talking about wealth? Are we talking about net income? Are we talking about consumption? Are we talking about a static one-off view or a sort of dynamic movie picture? Are we talking about individuals or households or iwi or whānau or quite what? Are we talking about before government has intervened with taxes and subsidies or afterwards? And this is complicated because they got quite different results depending on what different measures were being used, and I suspect that we could reproduce those in a New Zealand sort of context. The little booklet outside that I did was on COVID and looking at distributional effects. And the answer is it's complicated in a situation like that, a very unusual situation, a big shock. But a lot of it depends on what you're measuring, and it had some quite different impacts running through. But to get to your question, Andrew, on infrastructure, yes, I'm chairing the Infrastructure Commission. We have done an interesting report that came out a month ago on fairness views about infrastructure in New Zealand, and that's a big issue because we pay on average households spend something like $13,000 on infrastructure. I'm talking about roads, I'm talking about buildings, social buildings, hospitals, schools, drains, bridges, electricity, telecommunications, a whole range of things. And we wanted to know what their views were on this, and 3/4 of the people we surveyed said they thought it was fair that you should pay for electricity and telecommunications and water, maybe surprisingly, on the basis of usage. When it came to transport, it was a completely different and quite confused sort of picture. Most people actually don't know how transport is being paid for, and it is indeed quite complex. Quite a lot of misconceptions. So there's quite a big issue about tolling at the moment, particularly tolling on the road being built out of in the Manawatu. And most people, well, in the Manawatu case, saying that's not fair, we've paid for that road, shouldn't have to be paid for by tolling. Actually, tolls will pay for a tiny, tiny proportion of the road. But one thing I would like to say here is that we often don't talk about who's going to fund these things when they're publicly provided. And that is hugely important if you're interested in equity. So in infrastructure, would it be paid for by users or by beneficiaries or by tolling or by charging or by levying or by some hypothecated tax or by general income tax or by debt? And the answer to that is going to determine a huge amount of who pays in all of this. So, I don't know, picking up, Jonathan, on what you were saying about future generations and climate change, I mean, absolutely, I agree your points. But something like infrastructure is a capital cost, so it's not just money being spent now, it's an investment for a long time. And in some cases, like roading, it could have a very long life. So it's going to impact future generations one way or the other. Some of you will remember Auckland Light Rail from the previous government, a proposal to put a light rail scheme in from downtown Auckland to the airport. I regret to say the government refused to consider how that was going to be funded. There's a political problem in a lot of this. They don't particularly want to say that. They want to make promises and then somehow pay for it afterwards. The answer probably would have been broadly through general taxation. And that means that Southland farmers, Wellington bureaucrats, Northland Maori communities would all pay for Auckland traffic from CBD to the airport, which might be just business traffic, I don't really know. And in fact, you can immediately see a lot of inequities in all of that. It's very important that we don't ignore the funding in it all, but governments in infrastructure would rather make promises and ignore funding proposals and all of that. I'll make one final point, which is this is all much easier if there's economic growth.
Yes. Yeah.
And if there isn't growth, and we hear plenty of proposals for zero growth or degrowth, things are going to get a lot harder to get equity.
Yeah. I'm just going to come back to Philippa and make a contribution to this.
I mean, I think I wouldn't like to postpone it. I think it's really essential that we think about social infrastructure. And I'd like to talk briefly about housing, and particularly where the previous government decided to increase the number of public housing, state housing. And this was on the basis of the right to housing and the inequities between different ethnic groups, with Pacific people having even lower home ownership now than Māori. So if you think about who's going to pay, there's a very positive cycle if you're building investments of houses above code that are going to they're going to last 90 years. They're going to already take into account what we know how housing have got to be in terms of climate change, more winds, more rain. We're trying to reduce the amount of embodied carbon in it, so not building in concrete, but building in wood and so forth. And under the last government, there was Crown entity, Kāinga Homes and Communities, built up assets for the government of 43 billion, and then could use that as an asset base for then building new houses. And they built in the period 8,495 houses, which was more than had been built in the previous 12 years. So that was actually the debt to asset ratio is lower than the Reserve Bank's restrictions for borrowing for home lending if you have that many assets. So there's a kind of there's a very productive way of building houses that lets more people grow up in warm, dry housing in communities where there are lots of amenities, near to public transport, near to schools, and continue to buy and then to continue to build housing. Of course, what's happening is there's been a lack of agreement, and Kāinga has been told it's not allowed to build any more houses. So that doesn't have any money for building from the beginning and middle of next year. Now, what is supposed to happen is that the community housing comes in and then is given money to build housing, but there are 70 community housing groups, and we're doing a big amount of research on this. Apparently 5 of them have the capacity to actually develop and build houses. Kāinga is no longer allowed to build houses. And so that leaves you in the situation which we've already been in once, where the then Minister, Sir Bill English, who wasn't a Sir then, but Bill English, the Right Honourable, sold off the houses, didn't maintain them, and so we dropped the amount of public housing. It takes another 6 years to build them up again. So I'd say on infrastructure, one of the things that is social infrastructure in particular, we have to have agreement. We used to have dips and rises and sales and building and sales and building. Now they're like big sawtooth. And I think, I don't know how many of you walk around in Wellington, but I've been taking photos without taking people's faces, a huge increase in homelessness behind the toilets in Oriental Bay, in the Wakefield Park, and shop fronts. Now that is not coincidental. It's those people were in emergency housing or on the waiting list, and there's now nowhere for them to shift into. That I don't think is a fair society, and it's not one that I think is fair for those children. It's not the kind of society I want to live in.
Thank you.
So I think we should think of social infrastructure as much as roads.
Can I? I'm going to come back to me now and talk about te tiriti issues. I'm just bouncing off the discussions here. One of the for the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, one of the key recommendations I think is what is needed is a commissioning model, funding model to support communities in the similar ways which whānau order provides support for service provision, including housing, and trusting communities to provide forms of child care, but not just focused only on tamariki and youth, but also whānau and making whānau healthier. And you can see the tribunal's been looking at this for a long time now in the context of health and COVID and more recently homelessness, that the variety of collectives out there that are offering these services, NGOs, some are tribal, some are not, some are urban Māori authorities, but there are many treaty partners, if you like, and it's something that the tribunal's trying to emphasise is the variegated ways and means in which Māori organise to provide for their communities. Is one thing, is that it needs to be recognised more than it has so far, that it's not just tribes, for example, who have enjoyed a resurgence because of the treaty settlement process, and that has to be recognised. But it's much more complicated, but also that these many different forms of the treaty partner are exercising Article 2 rights of tino rangatiratanga, and that is they want to have control over the design and the delivery and the monitoring of services, and that's another major issue that we're confronted with at the moment. I think what we have with treaty settlements is we've come to the phase where they're almost at a close, and what we're now encountering is this next era of Māori communities and this very multitudes of different treaty partners wanting to make that service provision, and it's not necessarily iwi that are providing it. And that's one of the challenges that we face today. Okay, so I'm going to move back now to...
Sorry, just saying that, I mean, I think we're talking either or. For example, Kāinga didn't build houses, they worked with private developers. We work with community agencies. There was a big, with a number of te kuratau working with Māori communities. I don't think we have to think about just communities and just the state and just
yes.
private sector. I mean, a lot of we were able to say to the builders, now we want Māori apprentices here working. So you can leverage the experience and the assets of different people to achieve that, rather than, I understand, the desire for sovereignty, but I also think there's a useful working together and learning from each other.
Yeah, I think I've just been reading Belgrave's new book on the treaty and New Zealand history. It's been interesting, but one of the things that stuck with me too also is the state has always been there in everything. And one of the things with the inquiry is that, with the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care, is that the strong voice was that the state needs to step back, and communities need to step forward and do that service provision. So it's breaking with the tradition, really, was the ask that we received and heard throughout the community. So yeah, it's getting interesting now, Philippa.
Egregious, ghastly example, the state care, and having been a clinical psychologist and seeing what's happened there was just absolutely appalling. I think different sectors have different pathways, but certainly the state was very culpable then.
Yes. Okay, so Professor Boston, I thought I'd move to that third point about adaptation. It's going to cost a huge amount of, coming back to funding for that, seawalls, flood banks, relocation of communities. So the question really is, how do we make a principled and fair decisions about who gets what, who's protected or relocated, who gets paid out? Rebecca's got here, do we have to swallow dead rats like paying out industries who have profited from environmental and climate degradation?
All right. So, Andrew, I'll answer that question in a moment, but if I could just quickly just reflect on some of the comments of Alan and Philippa. I think in what I've heard both of them comment on, we see, if you like, different principles of justice coming to the surface, and we also see these principles often being in tension. And we see within the community at large, through survey work, people having different intuitions about what is fair or what is just. So, for example, right now, and this is climate related, there's been a recent survey of people's attitudes towards risk-related insurance premiums. And over the last X number of years, more and more New Zealanders think that having risk-related insurance premiums is fairer than having some sort of community-based or common pooling of risk. And those of you who own properties in Wellington will be aware that Wellington cops it quite badly when it comes to risk-rated premiums. And as a consequence, for homes of roughly the equivalent value between Auckland and Wellington, Wellingtonians are paying about twice as much for their home insurance as people in Auckland. Now, surveys indicate roughly 45% of people think that's good, that's fair. But then there's an alternative intuition, which is to say, no, that's not fair, because many people have no control over the risks associated with their homes. We don't know whether there's going to be an earthquake, in the next 5 minutes in Wellington, or whether there's going to be a volcanic eruption in Auckland, or perhaps an earthquake somewhere in the South Island, or one offshore, which will destroy much of the East Coast. And so the argument would be we need to pool risk, and indeed that's what we've done to some extent through what used to be called EQC, now the Natural Hazards Commission. So on the one hand, you have the sense of an intuition saying fairness requires people bearing the risk that they want to take. Others saying, no, that's not fair, because people often don't know what the risks are, or they end up being in a house which proves to be risky, which they hadn't anticipated. And with climate change, of course, we're going to have very significant shifts in the level of risk that we will experience, whether from fires, wind, sea level rise, more severe floods, and so on. Just quickly on Alan's point about economic growth. Yes, obviously economic growth facilitates dealing with many issues more readily, because you've got a bigger pie to distribute. But we also need to be conscious there that some types of economic growth may be damaging to long-run economic growth because it undermines the natural world, destroys species, and so on and so on. So, one needs to think very carefully about the kind of growth. And likewise, in terms of housing, Philippa, and you're, I know, very conscious of this, there's a huge need for housing, no question, but we shouldn't ideally be building houses in flood-prone areas because that is going to put people's livelihoods, lives, and well-being at stake in the future. But because of the strong pressure politically and in other ways right now. Thousands upon thousands of homes are being consented in areas that are flood prone. 2,000 at least in Auckland since the anniversary floods last year. So lots of competing considerations here, which make for very complicated discussions. Now, quickly, coming back to climate change and adaptation issues. Those of you who are interested in this, and I hope many of you are, I was involved with a so-called expert working group last year in 2022 for the Ministry for the Environment, an expert working group on managed retreat or planned relocation. And so we looked very carefully over a year or so at the kinds of costs that adaptation would entail, and looked particularly at the question, who should bear the cost of moving households and communities, in some cases whole suburbs, out of harm's way. Within a century or so, a significant proportion of the Hutt Valley, particularly Petone and so on, will likely not be livable unless people are living in houses on large stilts because of sea level rise.
And St Clair and South Dunedin is already not habitable. The water table is only a few inches below the joist.
That's right. So all over the country, we're going to have to move significant numbers of people out of harm's way. There will be cases where some kind of flood protection, Andrew, will be cost effective, but in most cases, it's going to be more cost effective to move people. One of the risks of protection is that you lull people into a sense of false security. And so you get more development occurring in flood-prone areas, and then when you have a 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 year flood, you lose a lot of valuable property and potentially lives as well. So I think we're going to have to move almost certainly tens of thousands of people, if not more, this century, and looking out over the coming few centuries here in New Zealand, we'll probably have to move hundreds of thousands of people, and globally we'll be moving hundreds of millions of people. This is going to be incredibly, incredibly disruptive, create mass migration of a kind that will, in my view, unfortunately, undermine democratic governance all over the world. It's simply going to be, I think, impossible for democracies to cope. Unfortunately, that's another part. But the question of who should pay, coming back to the expert working group, we basically said in relation to residential properties that there should be some public funding, there should be a compensation scheme, but that it should be tightly organised so that there is a cap on the total level of assistance that is provided to households that are required to be relocated. That cap could be set in a variety of ways. It could be set relative to average house prices. It could be set relative to the cost of building a modest alternative home. And we're just talking about the home, not land. And we also suggested, though I appreciate this is potentially both controversial and complicated to implement, we suggested that only principal places of residence rather than second and third homes should be eligible for public assistance. Now, just quickly to say, it is pretty clear that there is some support among the political parties, having talked to MPs across the political spectrum, for the idea of having some sort of cap. That is seen as being fair. People don't think it's fair, generally speaking, to provide compensation for multimillionaires, owning second homes on a beachfront. But there are exceptions to that.
Alan.
Yeah, thanks. So that's really interesting, Jonathan. I hope you're wrong on some of those projections, and you might be, but we'll don't know, obviously.
Well, I hope I'm wrong too, Alan, but I'm just going on what the mainstream science is saying, and we're almost certainly going to have multi-metre sea level rise over several centuries. If not within a century, Alan, and that will be, enormously devastating globally.
What I was going to say, though, was that resilience in New Zealand is a real issue for infrastructure, absolutely from climate change, but also anyway. And in fact, the big amounts of money in the past have been earthquake damage and landslip. And we've seen plenty of examples of that, and we will continue to do that. It may be that it's not the government that leads on this, it might be the insurance industry. Interestingly, the insurance that we're talking about here is really only being provided by only 3 providers in New Zealand now. And arguably there are some anti-competitive practices in that, or at least uncompetitive practice in that. And in some areas you can only get insurance from one particular provider, and you won't always necessarily be able to. There's been things like after COVID, insurance rates went up considerably. Now what is happening there? Is that an assessment of pandemic risk that's driving that? And why? It seems to me there's a confluence of things where insurance industry is pushing up premium, and it's not always real risk, it's some other things as well in all of that. Of course, the big thing in all of this isn't in New Zealand, it's in Southeast Asia. And we already worry about sea level and the Pacific Islands, but climate change in Southeast Asia could affect 1 billion people living in deltas around the river mouths. It already is affecting them. And that is going to lead to some very interesting migration questions that I don't think we've been really thinking about much so far. But there's one thing where we should take account of and watch what they're doing there, which is there is much more preventative work like seawalls. In New Zealand, it's sort of got a bit religious on this, which is that we shouldn't be looking at these devices to stop existing or what looks to be trends in sea rise. But try explaining that to a Singaporean, where there's a seawall around the country and it's going to grow because they're growing the country as well. And I think there is something we should be learning from some of this also, while bearing in mind there will be some retreat that does need to happen in a bunch of this. But all of moving houses doesn't matter just about moving houses, it's about moving pipes, wires, roads, and a whole lot of other things which are hugely expensive and which are difficult in this. It's a big intergenerational equity issue. Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist, has made some pretty strong statements about how her generation has been hurt by what could be the biggest market failure in history, and she may well be right on that. But she hasn't noted so much that her Swedish ancestors paid for her to have good education, good health, and good housing. So it works both ways in terms of intergenerational transfers and all of that, and it's a complex story and we need to look at both sides.
Thank you, Alan. Philippa, did you want to add to that? No, I good? Yeah, I think we should too. Actually, I think it's time, before everybody starts yawning. And where's the microphone? Let's get it out there.
Kia ora team. Firstly, thank you for all of your work on this and certainly for appearing today. My question comes in two parts. First of all, which do you consider to be more important, equity or equality? And secondly, what structural changes would you make to New Zealand's tax system, if any, to affect those desired outcomes?
Shall I start? Look, very quickly, just to say, without going into tax, I'll let other people talk about tax, that the principle of equality is arguably one of the principles of equity, of fairness or justice. If one's prepared to use those terms, fairness, justice, and equity, interchangeably. And so within that context, equity is arguably more important. The question then becomes, under what circumstances is equality a relevant consideration, and equality of what? Equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, equality of income, equality of wealth, and so on and so on. Alan mentioned, for example, that some of the students thought, equality of opportunity was an important principle. Immediately, however, that begs a lot of questions, doesn't it? One is, well, what kind of opportunities should be equalised? Opportunities to have holidays in Bali, opportunities to go to the moon, opportunities to have a decent home that is dry and without mould and so on. And that then leads obviously to a whole raft of further questions. And even if one thinks that many opportunities should be equalised for some reason, there's then the question, well, how does one do that? And that, of course, raises questions of taxation, which I'll leave to others.
Thank you. Other pins, Philippa?
Yes, in lots of languages, actually, there's no distinction between equity and equality. So it's not. There's a kind of fashion of it that went through New Zealand in public health of equality, particularly social and economic and environmental determinants of health. And then there was a move to a rather higher level equity. So it's not a debate I find is absolutely critical, that one. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Goodbye. Alan?
But look, can I simply say, treating people equally who are not equally deserving or of having equal needs would not, in my view, be equitable. So I do think, whether or not some civilizations have failed to make a distinction, we have, and we should. Well,
they make a distinction. I mean, there's the other one, from each according to his ability and from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And so, I mean, there are ways of cutting across it.
Yes, but both the principle of ability and the principle of need are principles of justice, and as is the principle of equality. So... anyway, forgive me.
Alan, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, to each according to their ability and from each according... Sorry, the other way there. That was Lenin, wasn't it?
Yes.
Marx.
Well,
Marx. It was Marx.
Okay, well, that worked really well.
Well,
on equality, I mean, I think the answer depends on asking New Zealanders what they want, assuming you can get an informed debate on that. And so I don't know what the answer is, but to me that's a citizen question. On tax, well, I should answer this because I used to be Treasury Secretary, and I do recall more than one minister from more than one government over the years talking about how we could design or redesign tax systems partly for equity reasons, not entirely. And quite often being disappointed with what we would come back with, which would clearly impact middle classes, but was quite difficult to impact people with lower income, because they're not generally paying tax anyway, or at least not an income tax anyway. And with something we haven't talked about, which is very wealthy people, which is another issue and quite a problem, and I think quite an economic problem as well as a social problem. One would hope that an economic system would provide a suitable incentive for people to put risk on the line and bear the rewards from that risk. But that used to result in millionaires, and now it seems to result in billionaires. And that is a problem because there's a big rent in that from an economic point of view. Those people didn't need all that money to be incentivised to do that good. Secondly, it is very difficult to deal with high income people because they are mobile, they've got very good tax advice, they know where tax havens are, and in fact, while one would like from an equity point of view to put income tax up at higher levels, the results would generally be pretty disappointing on that. But to be a bit more positive, what should we do? Capital gains tax, everybody else in the OECD's done it. And tax bad stuff. And the most obvious big bad stuff around at the minute, it seems to me, is methane emissions. We're not taxing those properly, we're not pricing it properly. And so going back to what Jonathan's saying on who's going to pay for the legacy side, that's one thing, but who's paying for the current situation is another quite unsatisfactory situation from my point of view in that, and there's other climate issues as well, where at least the ongoing situation would be made more acceptable if we were properly pricing these things. And there's a number of pollution in a broad sense areas where we're simply not.
I think the contention that if we tax people on very high incomes, they're going to leave or they know how to avoid paying the tax in the countries. I mean, countries like I was just hearing from Finland had just introduced to increase their wealth tax. And in fact, there was very few people left the country and there was a general consensus about it because they had created a sense that the country, particularly with what's happening on some of the borders, needed to work together to make sure everybody was well educated and well housed. And so I think it depends on whether it's seen as a punishment or it's a contribution to the social good.
Just my view on the definition of equality and equity. I think equality is you treat everybody the same. Everybody gets $5, say. Equity or substantive equality is that somebody might get $10 in order to get up to the same position as others relative to them. But there's a third dimension, which is like a self-determination concept where people determine. Make the decisions about allocation of resources. That's a prior question. It's a kind of indigenous question, if you like. That's on top of those kind of formal human rights ideas of equality and equity, self-determination, I'd call it. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for the very advanced discussion thus far. I'd like to take this just to draw some commentary on a Nobel Prize from about 15 years ago to Elinor Ostrom. And in talking about these sorts of issues, she unfortunately didn't outlive her prize by terribly many years, but just far enough to suggest that it could address many of the issues we're facing. The idea is that a small set of rules for governing common pool resources, about 8 rules, perhaps they could be stated in plain English better than they usually are. I think they're understandable, and they might allow polycentrism, that is to say, maybe where government fails, the private sector, say insurance industries, step forward, or communities step forward, and we enable place-based policy in a way that we can't generally evolve across the country. And by having rules within groups and then rules between the groups, it's possible to govern society in a way that's more equitable and more equal. Perhaps that problem with that is simply that we can't manage to get around to agreeing on the rules, or that we keep talking ourselves out of identifying the things that we're talking about today, like infrastructure and housing, as common pool resources, which is the prerequisite for using rules. I'm sure you've thought about this at some point. Could we get some commentary on that? Thank you.
I think that's a very good point, and she would have had quite a different view about how you regulate and tax the dairy industry in New Zealand, as an example. But it goes wider than that, and of course what we're seeing in some areas is a breakdown of rules where they have to be done internationally as much as nationally. And I mean, most obviously, Trump's proposals on tariffs will have huge distributional effects in the US and in other countries, including trickle-down ones here as well. And that's because partly because they're breaching the international rules that were broadly accepted following Bretton Woods. There's plenty of other examples as well, but I think internationally that's certainly important.
If I could just very quickly comment, I think Elinor Ostrom did fabulous work, and while I'm not an economist of Alan's stature, I do think it was utterly appropriate for her as a political scientist to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. Having said that, the conditions that she, or the rules and conditions that she applied in her work in relation to common property resources are quite exacting, quite demanding, and arguably apply only in specific and limited contexts. Now, you can, of course, apply perhaps a different set of rules in other contexts, but I think we have to be mindful that her approach isn't universally applicable to all common property resources in all contexts. The second thing I'd simply say is, building on what Alan said, is there's a serious issue of, if you like, overall governance and enforcement, whether that's at the international level for managing the atmosphere or managing the oceans as big global common property resources, but also at a sub-global level, at the national level and so on. And it's pretty clear that, even the most, how can I put it, well-governed countries struggle in the management of various kinds of common property resources. Final quick comment would be to say I'm very much in favour of the kind of experimental method of trying things, assuming that you have a reasonable basis for thinking that what you're trying could work. So experimenting with different governance arrangements, different rules and so on, I think has merit. And one of the advantages we have in the kind of world we have at the moment is that you have, in many areas of policy, different regimes, and we can learn from those regimes and what impacts they have, if we choose to.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add, of course, her famous book was The Tragedy of the Commons, thinking about everybody who'd put their cattle and so forth on the commons, and gradually it all got privatised. People who live next to the green belt, which you can see all around Wellington, extend their garden round, or things happen to it, and the belt gets smaller. I mean, so I do think that we have examples in New Zealand where that occurs, which we should really... I've just finished reading Mike Joy's biography, and he shows that in fact there's the tragedy of the rivers in New Zealand, and his people, the refuge that comes from industry, just in the Waifatu stream, all up and down where there's the dairying going into it and factories and stuff. So we're not very good at even acknowledging that, and monitoring it and saying, we're going to prosecute you. Hardly anybody's been prosecuted. And it's the same with housing. I see we're getting rid of housing regulations now, and so that builders can just say, yes, we can know how to do it. Well, we've already been there. We've had billions of dollars of damage from leaky buildings because people said that they knew what they were doing and it wasn't monitored. So most of us cut corners. And there are very few saints that do things exactly as they're supposed to, on time, perfectly, time and time again. So I do think we're pretty slack in New Zealand about checking what happens, and people, even if they admit to doing wrong, don't really get prosecuted or have big fines. If you Mike Joy's book, hardly anyone's fined of the people who've done all those big emissions. Or, what's happened in the smelter, or,
Yes. Yeah, but it made me think of the Te Arawara settlements, the treaty settlements, and actually the Waikato River and the Wanganui River too. A lot of that is really about healing the lakes and the rivers again. So the tribes now are required to, restore them and rejuvenate them. Jonathan, were you?
Oh, look, I was just simply building on what Philippa has rightly said. I mean, the issues that you raise, Philippa, are fundamentally issues of justice. We have people doing considerable harm to the environment and then to future generations. Potentially, we have a situation where the profits are being privatised and the downstream, literally downstream costs, are being socialised. And that is arguably very unfair. But it does raise the question, what do we do about it? It's pretty clear we've been struggling in relation to the dairy industry and some other industries for now generations, certainly decades, in trying to regulate them properly and enforce those regulations. It looks likely now under the current government that we're going to have weaker controls over fresh water than we might otherwise have had. Which means there'll be further damage for future generations to clean up if they are able to do so, and that in my view is a gross injustice. And yes, Alan, I mean, we may end up with slightly higher economic growth from the dairy industry in the short run, but somebody's going to be paying the costs, downstream.
Yeah, but Jonathan, when I said it's easier with growth, I wasn't talking about
I agree.
growth.
I'm simply making the point that we have to be concerned about the kind of growth we have.
Absolutely. There's an interesting phenomenon going on at the minute where some parts of the international market are saying to Fonterra, clean up your act or we're not taking your product.
That's right, which is good.
But that's the market.
Yeah.
Well, it's the market being driven, of course, by consumers who are saying to the companies, we don't want to be consuming products that are damaging our children's future. And that is, if you like, principles of justice being brought to the fore through community action and mobilised through shareholder meetings and so on, which is really good.
Okay, we've got another question here.
Thank you so much. I've really, really, really enjoyed listening to all of you. My question's maybe a little lighter, maybe a little easier, I don't know. It's really cool that in 1948 we had a UN Declaration of Human Rights, right? I think a lot about who is responsible for realising human rights, both in terms of the funding and the service provision of it. Where should this come from?
Well, we're struggling with that in Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Sudan. Yes, I mean we're in a pretty lawless era, and consequently, which we think in part is generated by climate change and lack of water and various things. So, if major companies withdraw from international courts, and if there's that, the people who at the UN assemblies can have a right of stopping debate, it's very difficult. And we need a whole very intense conclave to actually try and work that out. I mean, the WHO, Trump stopped most of the money to it. The last time we have, Ebola and things like that, there's very, very hard to get enough money to deal with them. So we are going to have other epidemics given the rising climates, and that's really worrying. I don't think we have answer of it. And it was just because the Second World War was so traumatic, and New Zealand, of course, Fraser went there and helped to negotiate all those things. So it's an open question, but it's a simple question, but it's a very good question.
Jonathan?
I was just going to say, it is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and as such, it was a declaration signed by now almost 200 nations. So the first port of call in terms of who has a responsibility for implementation is the nation state. But of course, it's not only the responsibility of nation states. Part of the reason for having a united nations, a collective, is that we can, through political pressure, trade arrangements, whatever, put pressure on individual nations to live up to the responsibilities that they have signed up to in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and all the other instruments, international instruments of various kinds that governments have signed up to. The challenge we have, of course, is we have a very weak global governance structure. And unfortunately, as Philippa is saying, that global governance structure is becoming almost weaker by the day, with countries simply ignoring the decisions of the UN and indeed the judicial institutions that have been established, such as the International Court of Justice. So we are, in my view, really troubling times in which there are now very big threats to a rules-based international order. But, Alan, this is much more your territory. You've been working for international organisations and heavily involved in that field.
Alan's passing, but I agree with Jonathan that the first step is a state obligation for that declaration. It was a massive achievement. Other treaties have spilled out of it, many dozens of treaties that states have signed up to, and it's their obligation. They're monitored by treaty bodies, many of them. So it's a way of keeping a check. Civil society participates in these monitoring processes. We've got a Human Rights Commission down the road there somewhere. They're all actors here to ensure that the state complies. But it seems more recently that the obligations are extending beyond states to include corporates now. So you've got the John Ruggie's principles for business and human rights, and I think about the right not to be tortured, for example, in the Universal Declaration, and life, liberty and security, and the Royal Commission inquiry into Lake Alice and other institutions, that the obligation there isn't just the state to provide the supervisory functions, it's the people there working there who know what is going on or have a sense that also have these human rights obligations, I think. So gradually we're starting to extend the concept beyond just the state so that we're all complicit in some way and have responsibilities.
Another question here.
Good evening. Considering you're all academics, I'm very interested in your thoughts in how well universities do in reducing inequality and how they might be able to do better. We're all aware that they do a good job in reducing economic inequality, but whether there's any other aspect you'd like to comment on. Thank you.
I've just been appointed to the Tertiary Education Commission, so I will respectfully decline to answer that question.
So when you ask the question what contribution the university is making to perhaps reducing or indeed increasing inequality, I mean, one can answer that in a whole variety of ways. One can think about it globally, one can think about it locally, one can think about the actual individual university, or one can think about Alan's responsibilities in the near future, which is the university system as a whole, or the tertiary system as a whole. And it seems to me that if you wanted to approach this from a principled point of view, including principles of justice, I'll be naughty and say you could perhaps have a look at my 1988 book on how to fund tertiary education, which quickly became out of date because I have long supported relatively low fees, and I lost that debate. I did manage to help influence a former government to introduce income contingent loan scheme rather than having some other kind of perhaps privately run loan scheme, which would be potentially disastrous. So at least we do have an income contingent loan scheme which has some equity associated with it. On the other hand, as one would have to say straight away, there is no interest rate applied, at least for domestic students living in New Zealand. And arguably that has an unfairness associated with it. It significantly increases the state's cost, because roughly about 40% of every dollar that's borrowed is being paid for by the state under the current arrangement, as I understand it. So I think, I would approach this, thinking about some of the relevant principles, but I'd also think about it at the national level primarily rather than the individual university level. The individual universities have only a modest capacity to address issues of equity. They certainly can, but it's more marginal. Thankfully, thinking about issues of ethnicity, Te Tiriti issues and Pacifica issues and so on, I think the universities have made significant strides over the last few decades in encouraging and facilitating and enabling much greater participation by minority ethnicities in New Zealand, and ensuring that they are able to succeed by virtue of, if you like, an equitable, perhaps rather than an equal, dose of assistance while they're at university in terms of support. Sometimes financial, but particularly in terms of academic support and collegial support. So, a long way to go, however, a long way to go. And I feel deeply concerned about the current state of our universities. They are not well funded by international standards, and certainly the standards of the countries that we compete with, like Australia. I'm concerned that we're going to go backwards in terms of funding per student, which will damage the capacity to undertake research and recruit excellent academics. And I'm concerned that, about the kind of burden that many young people face under the current arrangements in which many of them are working, long hours for pay in order to meet their accommodation costs and so on. If you went to Denmark, if you were to go to Denmark, you would find that you don't pay any fees of any consequence, and you also get a universal student allowance. Denmark hasn't gone bankrupt yet.
And they've got a very high rate of social housing.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for plenty of food for thought. I'd like to pick up on the principles of justice and recognising that the point of view and context can vary that, so it's complicated. My concern is that in reality it's often perverted by perhaps privilege, people with conscious or unconscious bias, and I'm really interested to know how you can address that and how you can knock that back. I think both Jonathan and Alan gave us good examples of the beach house and 25% of mostly males who think everything is still fair, as fair as it was 30 years ago. The privileged don't see the doors open to them. Kia ora.
Yeah, and there's been very long history of anthropologists, and so that looking at who takes risk, and it's white males who usually are happy to take the most risk because they have the resources to get away from the risk, and it's people of colour and women who are usually suffer from a lot of the, whether it's war or unemployment or and homelessness. Most of the women are now increasingly women who are homeless. So I think the context is actually really important. And just to add something to your question at the back here, I mean, I do think organisations are critical because they have the ability to work out the answers to these things. And for one of the things that the universities do is they can be the conscience and critic of society. Now, there's not many organisations that allow criticism within the organisation and outside of it. You can get sacked if you're in a corporation, if you go into LinkedIn and criticise it and so forth. So that's one of the really, really important roles of universities, and the International Science Council links universities all around the world, and that's a kind of all trying to get clarity about fairness and equity. So I don't think we should just think at an individual level, and so I'd be very sorry to see our ratings in our universities are all going down at the moment, and that's a real problem.
So just a quick comment about gender and justice. The first is sitting up here about an hour ago and looking at the audience, I was struck by the fact that the overwhelming majority of people here are women. And that is not surprising because all the social science evidence I've ever read indicates that women tend to be more interested in issues of fairness and justice, even though the vast majority of what's been written about justice has been written by men. But I think that's an artifact of history and the fact that until recently women, didn't get the opportunity to go to university or even get taught to read and write. So the evidence is that women are generally more concerned about issues of justice and fairness, and I think, Philippa, that reflects what you were just talking about, namely their experience of unfairness, which may be unfairness in the home in terms of allocation of work responsibilities, domestic responsibilities. It may be in terms of unfairness in the labour market, in terms of being paid less and having greater difficulty securing more senior positions because of childbearing and prejudice and so on. It probably also reflects the fact that it's typically women who end up being poorer in contexts of family breakups and in terms of household living circumstances and so on. So, and I think what you experience almost certainly affects, how you see things. So it's perhaps no surprise then that, if you ask people in Scandinavian countries questions about taxation and so on, about social expenditure, they will be more inclined to support their kind of a regime than people in New Zealand would be willing to support a kind of Scandinavian regime, because, what you experience and what you're familiar with and what you know tends to be absorbed and supported.
Just to say, I mean, right up until the middle of the beginning of the century, Sweden was a very poor country. That's why there's a whole lot of Swedes moved to America and Milwaukee and stuff like that. So I mean, we're a bit. There's a path dependency, as economists talked about. What has happened in the past will have an impact on it. And having spent quite a lot of time in Netherlands and travelling around the Nordic countries, they've all been invaded. And they know what it's like to have things done to them. And
some of them by Sweden.
Some of them by Sweden. Well, more further back. But I mean, the Finns had a terrible civil war, and they said they were never ever going to, during around the Second World War. One Finn is never going to imprison another one unless it's for something, completely someone out of control. So they have a hugely lower rate of imprisonment that we do. I think our imprisonment rate is really unfair, and that leads to a lot of the domestic violence and the kind of things that are happening in New Zealand. And now we're going to double the size of the Mount Eden prison. I don't think anybody should agree to that unless they go and spend time in there, which I have, and it's absolutely ghastly. So all the parima, or which are Bain and panopticons, where you don't have any privacy at all. And if there's not enough prison officers, you don't get to leave your room for days on end. I think that's really, really unfair.
Andrew,
Thank you, Philippa.
any last comments?
Yeah, any last comments here from across our panels? Alan, do you want to?
Yeah, I've got a last comment. Some of the discussion tonight has sort of been quite pessimistic in a way that actually some of the work over the last couple of years was in the Fair Futures panel. I don't wish to be labelled as saying this because I'm an older white male, but I go with Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor's conclusion, which is things are not all bad and they're actually getting better. And I think I can prove that with data.
Thank you. Philippa? You agree with Steven Pinker?
Rather out of context. No, I think it's very interesting to hear the ways that people have framed it in the audience. And I can certainly see that things were getting better in housing, but now they're getting worse again. And there's quite strong evidence, for example, that the stopping of all the contracts that Kāinga had has deepened the recession. And so I'm not particularly optimistic about housing. But I think, and generally, the fact that we're all living longer, there's been a whole lot of advances in things, and we have a lot of knowledge, and we're very lucky to be living in Aotearoa New Zealand. So if we can't do better here, I'm not sure where they can.
Jonathan?
Final word. I'm sure that Alan Pinker, given his extraordinary depth of knowledge, is correct on some of the measures that he's engaged in. But I also think we need to recognise that there are ups and downs in countries, and there's also ups and downs globally. And right now, it seems to me, we are in a time of increased suffering and dislocation and violence. And my concern is that given the kinds of pressures that are facing humanity, particularly from environmental degradation, from climate change, biodiversity loss and so on, the situation looking out over the coming decades is negative, at least for many of the things that matter to me and that I think will matter to lots of people. And unfortunately, from a justice point of view, I do feel, notwithstanding Alan's very valid point about the fact that we are standing on the shoulders of all those who have invested in our current situation, my generation, born post-war, has also contributed greatly to the loss of natural capital and the deterioration in ecosystem services across the world. And that loss is mounting rapidly and is going to have huge intergenerational costs and consequences. And most of that is very sad, very negative and unjust.
Thank you, Jonathan. And if I think about, quite right to be pessimistic about treaty issues at the moment with the current administration, but actually I go against the grain on that. I think that we needed to go through this period that we're going through at the moment. I think it's with treaty settlements coming to a close, there was a whole lot of unfinished business for Māori in terms of treaty settlements promote participatory rights, local government, at central government, and that's great. But there was still a sense of, whereas by Māori for Māori, it was still power imbalance with the executive that ultimately calls all the shots and determines who they want to speak with. So we needed to have this reckoning and discussion and debate, and it's very negative, but it's great to see kotahitanga across iwi coming together. Matiki mai, the proposals there were always incrementalist. They always saw this as a long-term plan, might be beyond 2040, but still it's just, this, I think, is a necessary part of the debate that's going to move us in that direction. What goes into that sphere called tino rangatiratanga, it's not quite clear from Matiki mai, but I think that's part of the debate that we need to be having about what qualifies to fall in that sphere, and how do Māori engage with the executive is the next challenging question. How do we do that effectively? But we've been doing that for a very long time. Before the treaty, 1835, experimenting with whole ideas about self-government. So that discussion has been going on a long time, and the relationships are there. It's just more work needs to be done to formalise and come up with a mechanism to make it healthier and enduring. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much. It is my role to try and wrap the evening up. But one of the things I will definitely not do is try and summarise everything that's been said, and you'll be grateful for that. But I do want to just thank you for what has been an incredibly rich conversation. There's one word that has come through it time and time again. Jonathan, you mentioned it right at the end there, and that's the word intergenerational. I think we not only have a responsibility, I think we have an absolute, undeniable, fundamental obligation. And that obligation is to future generations in just about every aspect of what we would apply the word fairness or justice to. It was mentioned in your first three principles, Jonathan, and that was the principle of how to ensure intergenerational justice. And it does seem to me that that is a fundamental element that runs through all of this deep, rich, vibrant, concerning, and very broad-reaching conversation that we've had this evening. So I would like to say thank you. Before I finish, I'd just like to say that after this, there will be refreshments served outside if you'd like to stay on and join us and carry on with an informal conversation about some of the things we've been talking about. And before that, I will invite Tara to come and close us with a karakia. First, though, would you join with me in saying a huge thanks to Andrew, Jonathan, Philippa, Alan, for just a glimpse into the extraordinary work that went in a couple of years ago to this thinking. Please do pick up some of the documents at the back, and I hope that we have succeeded in bringing this back to front of mind, because it's an incredibly important topic. So please join with me in thanking our panel and all of you.
Kia ora. I failed to introduce myself earlier. Ko Tara Satinand tōku ingoa. I'm Tara. I work at the Society, and just like to add my thanks. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation on with you afterwards. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manakitanga mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ai o ki te aorangi. Thank you.